Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn, the Director of the Defense Program at the Center for a New American Security. Thanks for joining us today for this exciting discussion focused on the role that allies and partners play in the United States National Defense Strategy, which is the topic of a recent report that Becca Wasser and I wrote entitled No I in Team. This event is going to proceed in two parts. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Mara Karlin about the National Defense Strategy and implementation. Then in the second part, we have an outstanding panel discussion with officials from the United Kingdom and Australia, a representative from industry, and CNAS's own Becca Wasser to dive into these issues further. A few quick administrative notes. This event is being recorded and will be posted on our website after the fact. We are taking questions from the audience, but you need to identify yourself. You can submit a question via two methods. Either on Twitter, you can use the hashtag CNAS 2023, or using the chat function at the bottom of your screen, you can insert a question. I'm going to try to intersperse these as we go along with the conversation, so get your questions in early. To kick things off, I'm very honored to have with us today Dr. Mara Karlin, who's performing the duties of the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. She's also the Assistant Secretary for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities. And super importantly, she's one of the primary authors of the 2022 NDS. Dr. Karlin, I'm going to turn it over to you to offer some opening remarks about how implementation of the defense strategy is going with respect to the allies and partners line of effort.
Thank you so much, Stacy. It's a real pleasure to be here, and congratulations on putting out such a thoughtful report. I appreciated that the report very early on highlighted the importance of implementation, since that doesn't always get the same level of kind of energy, attention, and focus as an actual strategy document. But if it goes by the wayside, then of course the strategy can just be words on paper. And I'm delighted to tell you that is not at all the case with the 2022 National Defense Strategy. So as you know, of course, a couple months ago, the Department of Defense put out the National Defense Strategy, and for the very first time, put out all three of its major reviews together: the National Defense Strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review, and the Missile Defense Review. That really was important for ensuring a tight linkage between strategy and resources, and has been meaningful for implementation as well. And of course, the focus of that National Defense Strategy is the urgent need to sustain and strengthen deterrence, focusing on the People's Republic of China as the department's pacing challenge. That's because the PRC is the only competitor with both the intent and increasingly the capability to systematically change the United States across the board, militarily, economically, technologically, and diplomatically. And I'll talk a little bit about how we are realizing the NDS in that regard. I would also note that the strategy talks about Russia as an acute threat, one that is immediate and sharp. And while Russia cannot systematically systematically challenge the United States over the long term, we very much see Russian aggression threatening our interests and values and those of our allies and our partners. Russia's reckless war of choice against Ukraine has made that very clear and very real for the entire world. And we can't help but watch the Russian alignment with the People's Republic of China. Both seem to favor a world in which they can trample over the sovereignty of their smaller neighbors and have a free hand in their self-declared spheres of influence. Now, in talking about NDS implementation, I want to emphasize the importance of allies and partners. The NDS talks about allies and partners as our center of gravity, and the NDS really is a call to action for breaking down barriers to working with allies and partners on our common objectives. So much of what you and Becca have written in this report. So the NDS is the department's North Star, and we're working hard to implement it. I like to think of our implementation approach as really being a wraparound strategy to ensure that this strategy is infused in the department's day-to-day business. It's really three-pronged. We've got senior leaders who are reporting on how they are changing their policies, processes, and plans to align with the National Defense Strategy. We've got the secretary and the deputy secretary who are personally involved in regularly overseeing the implementation of the very highest priority National Defense Strategy efforts and convening key leaders across the department to discuss how it's going. And then at the working level, across the entire department, the components of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the military departments, the combatant commands, joint staff are all executing concrete tasks to realize that strategy. And as part of implementation, we're really working with our key allies around the world across all of these strategic ways: integrated deterrence, campaigning, and building enduring advantages. We're also working closely to align our strategy with our allies' defense strategies as well. So I know you are intimately familiar with integrated deterrence. I thought I would just spend a moment on what it means for allies and partners, which really is ensuring that we have integrated across our department, across our interagency, and then very much with our allies and partners. They have a crucial role to play in realizing the idea of integrated deterrence, of being able to ensure that we can deter to those who seek to upturn the international order, and should we be in a different situation, in ensuring that together we can ensure security and stability. So I would note, of course, the concept of deterrence is not new whatsoever, but we're really trying to evolve our approach to it because it is just growing ever more important, as I think we are seeing pretty regularly with this dynamic security environment. So I'd like to very briefly talk about how we are enabling integrated deterrence in the case of the People's Republic of China and in the case of Russia. So in the case of the People's Republic of China, inside the Department of Defense, we're working hard to invest in a combat credible force, investing in critical capabilities across domains, especially cyber and space, and to ensure that our forces are able to do what is asked for them. So you've seen this in terms of our construction of new ships, our modernization of the Army and the Marine Corps, and the advancement of air power and key investments in various aircraft. You've seen a lot in the space domain as well in this regard, in terms of being able to field resilient satellite constellations so that we are able to ride through any challenges that might exist. And also within cyber, where we're boosting our resilience and enhancing our capabilities. With our interagency, when we are looking at operationalizing integrated deterrence, we've worked with a number of key actors to knit together an approach that makes sense vis-a-vis the PRC. And I would just really applaud our colleagues in Congress, particularly for the CHIPS Act, which has been really important in curbing our dependencies on the PRC. And then with our key allies and partners, we are building and deepening cooperation in the region. So a couple quick examples as that relates to the People's Republic of China. First, we're forming new geometries for cooperation, such as AUKUS. And that is, of course, Australia, the UK, and the United States. It's really a strategic partnership that's focused on enhancing regional stability and safeguarding a free and open Indo-Pacific. And it's going to provide Australia with a conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarine capability. And together, the three countries are going to develop and exercise joint advanced military capabilities. And we're accelerating the advancement of a bunch of different capabilities across areas as wide-ranging as artificial intelligence and autonomy and cyber, for example, to ensure that our warfighters can retain and expand their competitive edge. So that's one example of how we're trying to operationalize integrated deterrence vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China. Another example involves optimizing our posture in the Indo-Pacific. You've seen some really splashy, important announcements of this of late. So, for example, by forward deploying more versatile, resilient, and mobile capabilities in Japan, you've seen a lot of progress with what we've done in Australia. And then also most recently when the Secretary of Defense was just in the Philippines in terms of gaining access to different sites. That's all really meaningful when you look at our ability to project power, which is in many ways kind of the sine qua non of the US military. And the third example for how we are operationalizing integrated deterrence vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China, of course, is how we're expanding our joint exercises in the Indo-Pacific. As you know, we're used to exercising bilaterally and multilaterally, but what we're really trying to do is change and enhance the size, scope, scale, and character of these exercises. So a great example would be Garuda Shield, which was an exercise of 14 nations that occurred a couple months ago. You've seen joint maritime drills with Canada, Japan, the United States, and Australia in the South China Sea, really showing how our different countries can knit together our capabilities and employ our forces together. Let me very briefly turn to some examples that relate to operationalizing this collaboration with allies and partners in the case of Russia in realizing integrated deterrence. And I think you've seen this really loud and clear over the last year plus or so. Now, inside the Department of Defense, of course, we did a lot to surge U.S. forces to Europe as the conflict was kicking off, and surge from 80,000 to 100,000 troops in Europe to reinforce our posture. And frankly, that was doable because of our very close relationship with so many of those countries, because of pre-positioned equipment that was there, also thanks to Congress with the European Deterrence Initiative. And moreover, we've been able to build Ukraine's military and asymmetric capabilities through robust security assistance. You've seen a lot with the interagency and what they have done, and especially last week, I think, as we hit the year anniversary of this horrific conflict, you've seen what our Treasury colleagues have done and our State Department and Commerce colleagues have done as well, and of course the intelligence community, to ensure that we are all knit together in an integrated way to deter. And then with our allies and partners, we have seen our NATO allies stepping up to enhance their presence in Europe's east. We have seen this extraordinary united and resolute Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which involves the Secretary of Defense on a monthly basis, convening, I think, something around 50 or so of his counterparts to talk through and offer contributions to help Ukraine in its self-defense. And that has been crucial as well. I would also just note that, in Europe, of course, the United States has worked really hard to ensure we can maintain our bedrock commitment to NATO's collective defense. And we do that working hand in hand with our allies, of course. And so we're doing that both bilaterally and also, of course, multilaterally through NATO and through NATO's established processes, especially in terms of capability development and military modernization. And going forward, we're going to continue working with our NATO allies and our partners to build capacity across Europe's eastern flank to strengthen our defensive anti-access area denial capabilities and our indications and warnings, and to expand our readiness training and exercises, and to promote resilience, including as it relates to space and cyber. So I just want to wrap up by really underscoring my appreciation for your emphasis on implementation and just how crucial it is, and your emphasis on the need to make sure that we are really collaborating deeply with our allies and our partners. This is an unparalleled network, and for us to be able to work together at every stage of defense planning is crucial. That means we, of course, will have to address longstanding institutional barriers that inhibit collective planning, interoperability, and mutually beneficial procurement. So we're looking hard at all of those things, and look forward to learning more from you and the folks on your panel about how we can get after that in a way that makes sense. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Carlin. That was an amazing overview of the strategy and all of the work that's going on to implement it in the two critical regions that the U.S. is focused on right now. We're really grateful for your time. We're going to dive a bit more into some of these obstacles and think about ways to overcome them in our discussion that comes. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So now we're going to turn to the broader discussion with the entire panel. So let me introduce all of our participants. We have a great lineup here for you today that has representatives from the UK, Australia, and the United States to talk about this. So starting off, we have Shimon Fima, the Director of Strategic Programs in the UK Ministry of Defence. We also have with us Stephen Moore, who is the First Assistant Secretary of Defence Industrial Policy for the Australian Department of Defence. We have Mike Schnabel, who's a Senior Director of International Operation and Policy at Boeing. And then we have Becca Wasser, a Senior Fellow and the Director of the Gaming Lab here at CNAS. Welcome to you all. So great to see you. So I think Dr. Carlin gave us a lot of food for thought there and some issues to unpack. I'm going to turn to Becca first. And we heard a little bit about the advantages of working with allies and partners. Can you explain in a bit more detail why you think it's so important today and into the future for the U.S. to really integrate with its allies and partners in a way that we haven't done in the recent past? And in doing so, can you talk about how we thought about integration more broadly in our report and sort of the framework we laid out for thinking about how to approach this issue?
Sure. Thank you so much, Stacy. It's great to roll out our report, and thank you so much to all of my fellow panelists. It's great to be here with you all, at least virtually for now. So I think, as we've heard from Dr. Carlin, really what's happening is that the United States faces a threat landscape that's unlike any it has faced in its past. The unipolar moment is over. We have two nuclear armed powers in the form of China and Russia. China is very much a rising military threat, and while Russia has, has a degraded military based on its poor performance because of its invasion of Ukraine, it still is quite dangerous. And then you also have a myriad of other persistent threats that the United States is going to need to keep at bay. But what also makes this time unique is that the United States military is undergoing a period of modernization. It's trying to free up resources for modernization. So you've got a much smaller force size, divesting of legacy capabilities, and perhaps maybe a force that's less ready for some of the threats that it might face. So really what you have is this interregnum, if you will, where the benefits of modernization haven't yet borne fruit. And that leaves the United States in a precarious position. And that's one of the reasons why the United States can no longer go it alone. It needs to work with its highly capable allies and partners to deter potential aggression by China and Russia, and as well as managing some of those other threats. It's the combined collective capability that all of these nations have together and what they can bring that demonstrates credibility, that demonstrates resolve, and enables greater deterrence of some of those future threats. So with that as kind of background, part of what we were trying to do in developing our framework is to help the DoD implement its concept of integrated deterrence, and really trying to help not only the United States, but also some of our most capable allies and partners to think about how to get at deeper integration, right? We heard before, it requires changing how we've done business, but there's been a bit of a question as to how we could do so. So our framework highlights three different levels of integration. The first level is tactical integration, which I think we all know of as the most sort of common form of integration. We see this because it emphasizes interoperability, common platforms and capabilities, as well as common skill sets. The next level of integration, and a slightly higher form of integration, is institutional integration. And I would argue this is actually where we see the most barriers to deepening cooperation. And part of this is because, at least from the DoD's perspective, it requires incorporating allies and partners into their processes. So those are processes like information sharing, to facilitate, collective force planning. It's, doing combined research and development. It's looking at capability development, all of these things that require a lot of sensitive information and cooperation. And then the last form of integration, which is the highest form of integration and the most difficult one to actually achieve, is strategic integration. And so strategic integration means developing really a shared appreciation of the threats and how to counter them. And in sort of trying to work through how to counter them, essentially, assigning roles and missions for how they would counter those threats. And because of that, it tends to be pretty sensitive and something, that often is difficult for allies and partners to do. And so, I think it's worth noting that integrated deterrence requires cooperation at all three levels of integration. But the one that is the most important is strategic integration. And the one that is currently most lacking is strategic integration. In theory, strategic integration is the level where you make decisions, and then all of your other decisions at the institutional level about those barriers that need to change, at what you're going to actually tactically practice and become interoperable in, those should stem from that strategic level. And, that's really what you need to make choices to create a shared vision in order to make that actually happen. I'll just end really quickly by saying there are a lot of barriers to making integrated deterrence a reality and to achieving each of these types of integration. We've seen that the United States has the ability to overcome some of these barriers, but only during crisis. We've seen that the US has been able to share really sensitive intelligence and other information with allies and partners in the run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But what we need to do is translate some of that energy and some of our ability to do that during crisis to peacetime, because peacetime planning, peacetime working together, whether that's strategic and operational planning, whether it's greater defense industrial base integration, or whether that is just trying to make the combined choices about future capabilities. Those all present really strong signals of credibility and resolve to China and Russia, and in so doing, enhanced deterrence. So I think we're going to talk a lot more about barriers, so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Becca. That's really helpful context, I think, for where we're going to go next, which is diving deeper onto defense industrial base cooperation, which clearly needs to happen in peacetime. We've seen that capacities today are insufficient to meet the needs of the ongoing war in Ukraine, let alone what is expected to be needed should a larger conflict break out directly with Russia or with China. So I'm going to address the elephant in the room first. Let's talk about AUKUS, even though we want to move beyond AUKUS and talk about other forms of defense cooperation that's going on among the UK, Australia, and the US going forward. So AUKUS is on everyone's mind. We're waiting for the Pillar 1 announcement that's supposed to be happening next month. But let's talk more about Pillar 2 today, where I think there is a growing sense of frustration in both Canberra and London about the barriers that are impeding progress on the future technologies that the three countries are supposed to be developing together. So I'm going to turn to Shimon first and then to Stephen. What is enough progress being made in your mind on sort of Pillar 2 of AUKUS, and what needs to be changed for things to really take off and to deepen the technological integration that is supposed to happen?
Thank you, and let me thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. So I think we need to celebrate what is going well, and whilst I recognise that there are challenges, I come back to the point that some of this is institutional, but the one thing that has absolutely changed is a recognition that at the political level, the political will is absolutely there to ensure that the barriers that we have are broken through. But taking that down from a political level, coming back to Becca's point around institutional impediments, that is the challenge, and that takes time, because when you have to work through some of the institutional challenges, it's about people, it's about cultures, and that takes time because the history has been there for some time. In my own experience and the experience that we absolutely have and continue to see some really positive movement in that space. Clearly, there is more work, and we need to think about how we change the paradigm of how we operate and how we work, where we are all comfortable and give individuals who are responsible for capabilities the cover that they need to be able to share information. My own, and that applies in all nations. We also need to recognize that, as has been said a number of times, when in a crisis, we find a way through it. But we seem to struggle to really work at the pace that is necessary when we aren't in those situations. So from my perspective, this is a journey. It's a journey that we all recognize we need to work through more quickly than we are at the moment. But there are positives. But those activities that we are seeing, and I know this isn't just and shouldn't just be about AUKUS, but the willingness to share really sensitive technologies and capabilities in Pillar 1, if we can do that, and we can do that at pace, we must be able to do that in Pillar 2. And so whilst the movement is happening, I think there's an opportunity to really energize that more than we are at the moment.
Okay, so that is an optimistic note to move on. Stephen, what is your perspective on this? Do you think enough progress is being made on Pillar 2, and what needs to be done to see further progress in this area?
No, thank you, Stacey, and thank you to CNAS for convening this discussion. I think it's a really important one, and I like a lot of what your paper talks about, the different levels of integration. I think I'm going to agree entirely with Shimon and his comments. We're seeing a level of political support for the integration that you're talking about that I think we've not seen before, across information sharing, across the way that we get industrial-based collaboration. You look at some of the OSMIN comments from last year and the year before that talked about the need to facilitate information sharing and technology transfer in ways that we've not done before. And I do think that there is a great deal of goodwill and momentum that is beginning to build behind that. You spoke about frustration in the UK and Australia. I would say that there is a frustration, I think, amongst all of us that our bureaucratic processes need to be better, and I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as something that is limited to the US, to the UK or Australia. I think that we know our bureaucracies need to be more agile and better equipped to face some of the strategic challenges that we are looking at, and I think there is momentum there. There is a clear will to do that, and we are getting at that. But institutional integration is really difficult, as Shimon said. It requires cultural change. It requires a bravery on the part of people that have to implement these policies to be able to make the sorts of changes and progress that we need. And that's a difficult thing. I don't know if you have looked at export control regulations recently. They are large and voluminous, and these are difficult things to work through.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, no, export controls were one of those barriers that seems to keep cropping up in people's mind, especially ITAR. Mike, I'd like to bring you in now and bring in your perspective as someone who is in industry today, but also previously when you were in the U.S. Air Force, and move this broader than just AUKUS, because the United States and the United Kingdom and Australia have a lot of cooperation that occurs outside of that strategic partnership. What do you see as some of the biggest barriers to deepening defense cooperation between these three countries?
Yeah, thanks for that, Stacey, and thanks to your and Becca's work to sort of stimulate this greater conversation through what you guys are working on. At risk of turning it right back to AUKUS, right? I think the barrier is some of those export control regulations that both that Stephen and you were talking about, right? So I think we have a real opportunity with AUKUS because it's shown a light on that, the situation as it is. I think when AUKUS first came out, everybody in industry had every business unit in all of our companies trying to figure out how to jam something, a particular product into that. And as it's developed, that it was clear that was not going to be the case, but it's an opportunity for the future. And I'll speak a little bit about U.S. export controls, right? Like ITAR, what you like or don't like about it. I think most would agree that it doesn't quite move at the pace we would want it to if we want to out innovate the Chinese. And I would say, and that's even with our closest allies. And I would say another thing it doesn't quite account for is working, across industrial bases at a developmental level. Right now in U.S. industry, if we have something that we would want to work with, say, I'll just say for Boeing, for our Boeing Defense Australia or Boeing Defense UK teams, to get a license to work at a developmental level, we're going to have to find a way to develop a technology enough for us to be able to describe it to U.S. policymakers first, which is going to take time, and then apply for a license and then hope it comes back. What we'd like to be able to do is work at the brainstorming idea level from the start, put all three industrial bases to work to come out with the best products as quickly as possible, and not end up with siloed operations between the three countries, and then compare ideas when they're mostly mature. And I would say, with respect to ITAR, as we come up with good ideas, there's going to be the same type of policies from both the UK and Australia. And that's why I really think we have to attack it as a team. And AUKUS provides a great opportunity to do so.
That's definitely true. They're having all three work from the beginning versus one being in the lead, which sometimes can occur. And I know we've heard from some folks that ITAR can actually inhibit the desire of American allies to provide them with different technologies, because they then lose control over them and they're subject to those export controls, even if they initially develop them, which is sort of a really perverse side effect. So let's talk a little bit about which technologies or which capabilities we think are most important for these three nations to focus on developing together. Shimon, coming back to you, which areas do you think are a priority for the United Kingdom and should be a priority for this partnership?
So, at the expense of using AUKUS a bit too often as an area of focus, but I think it's really important, because what we've done in AUKUS is focus on those threats that we think are particularly strategic, and therefore when we think about where do we need to collaborate more closely, both at the idea stage but also more progressively through programmatics, we have been really clear. Undersea warfare is a really important area of capability that we must be able to get after at the pace that is relevant to the changing threats. That is absolutely critical. To be able to do that is not just about idea generation, and I think it's not just about capability. I would say it's about the ability and willingness to share a level of data that is, to be frank, unprecedented. Historically, that is really critical. So as it's a technology challenge, but actually when you take it back, it's a challenge of how do we share the level of information and data that gives us an awareness that collectively we need to get after. That to me is really important. There are areas that we have that you mentioned earlier around AI and quantum. They're really important. They're around technologies that we need to get after for the future. But it is in the critical domains that are there at the moment that we need to be able to keep up and outmatch our adversaries in this space. And as I said, it's a willingness around data. I'll pause on that one. There are absolutely others to cover.
Undersea warfare is incredibly important for the Indo-Pacific and having dominance there. And then data is so critical to how we see the way that militaries fight today. And there are so many barriers to sharing it there. Stephen, what's your perspective on this? Which capabilities or technologies do you think should be prioritized?
Look, I think we've been quite explicit in the sorts of technologies that we think we want to get after, and that's a pretty good list. I think that you've mentioned some of them, and so has Shimon. Things like advanced cyber and AI, electronic warfare, and hypersonics. That list has been developed because it is recognised that those capabilities are going to be particularly important to all three nations to develop. But I think, to echo Shimon, what really is the underlying benefit of that and the capability, I guess, that we are really getting at is the ability to recognise and seek out those technologies in each of our countries that are going to be most beneficial to us, to give us that strategic edge, and quickly share them amongst the countries so that we all benefit from that. So we don't have a particular technology that sits within one, but we recognise that there are skill sets and advanced capabilities that exist within all of our countries that we can quickly share and get that advantage from. And that's what I think the true capability of sort of integration that we are seeing between Australia, US, and UK at the moment.
Great. Becca, I want to pull you back in here. So we've heard about undersea warfare, hypersonics, quantum, some of these different technologies. Can you sort of make the case of why the partnership needs to go further in articulating why these specific capabilities are needed? And can you also elaborate a little bit into why the US needs to pursue co-development and co-production, which in some respects, if you're looking at very narrowly from a nationalist perspective, seems like it could hurt U.S. industry, and we'd prefer just to sell American products. Why isn't that the answer today?
Okay, so two pretty big questions. I'll try and take them on in a succinct manner because I know that we've got a lot of questions coming in that you want to get to. So I think one of the things that became abundantly clear to us as we were going through this paper and as we've been talking to various folks, particularly about AUKUS, but also other, collaborative engagements, that one of the things that is missing is actually creating a strategic narrative around why certain capabilities are required. There is, as we, heard from two of our fellow panelists, an understanding of why, for example, the undersea is so important, particularly if we're looking at future warfare, potential future warfare with China, but explaining exactly what missions any submarine would be able to do and what it would bring to bear and how that would benefit each country individually as well as collectively is part that's truly lacking. And I think really where this is most apparent is less so on Pillar 1 and submarines, but more so on Pillar 2, where it is a very wide array of capabilities that are assigned under that pillar. So, making the case for why hypersonics is a little bit different than making the case for, why electronic warfare or why there needs to be greater industrial, innovation as well. So trying to create those overarching narratives, it's a way, frankly, for, it to be sold collectively, among countries, as well as with other allies and partners who also have, various say in a lot of these, but also to some of the domestic political pressures that each country faces. Here in the United States, it's going to be really critical to get Congress on board for various parts of AUKUS, and particularly trying to make progress on some of those institutional impediments, right? Congress has a say in those as well. So having these overarching narratives would be very useful in trying to get everyone on board. The other question that you had is sort of making the case for, why it is that there's a benefit to doing co-production and co-development of capabilities. I could probably go on for a while about them, so I'll just mention some of the key wave tops, some of which we've already heard. So the number one is that it really allows the United States and its allies and partners to expand their collective capacity to produce the weapons that would be needed to defeat China or Russia in a potential future conflict. And in so doing, that actually allows the various countries to enhance deterrence in the more near term vis-a-vis China and Russia. I think it's also worth noting that trying to create a collective industrial base, it allows you to create a more resilient defense industrial base, which if you look at some potential target sets in future conflicts, you are definitely going to want to enhance the resiliency of your defense production capabilities. It also would enable more secure supply chains. I think we saw during COVID-19 how much there were supply chain disruptions. One could imagine that, again, in future conflict, there would be a lot more disruptions to some of our supply chains. And then, I think there's also a benefit when you're looking at that tactical level interoperability, right? co-development and co-production of capabilities really enables the United States and its most capable allies and partners to try and have shared platforms, shared weapons, shared systems, right? Communications is incredibly important, particularly as you look at how the United States plans to fight in the future with joint all-domain command and control. So that's incredibly important. And then the last one, which I think Shimon had mentioned, was working together actually allows at least the United States, and I think all of the various countries, to get out of sort of our own groupthink. It allows us to innovate better when we're trying to bring in, different scientists, engineers, you name it. It's a way to spark innovation, to try and think about how you can develop those future technologies and those future capabilities that we would want for some of the future threats that we think we're going to face.
Thanks, Becca. That's a great case, I think, for it. Mike, I would want to bring you in and to pull this thread a little bit more. And one of the things that's different today is that it's not always the United States who has first developed or has the best technology. And there are a couple examples of this recently, and this is sort of a new approach to defense integration that I think can provide a lot of opportunities, but is also presenting some challenges. So it was just announced this week that the U.S. Air Force is going to purchase the Wedgetail, the E-7 airborne management aircraft that was developed by Australia, has been purchased by the UK, and now the U.S. is going to also procure it. The other example out there right now, I know, is the MQ-28 Ghost Bat, which is being considered for the combat collaborative aircraft, the loyal wingman type system that would be accompanying a next generation fighter. Can you talk about some of the opportunities and then the challenges now that other countries sometimes are in the lead on these specific capabilities?
Yeah, I'll start where you did with E-7, right? So you have an aircraft built for Australia by U.S. industry, but for Australia without any requirement from the U.S. or anyone else, that sort of blossomed into eventually the U.K. and the U.S. and also Turkey and the Republic of Korea in there as well. And what's been great about that is we've had as the program has grown through multiple phases, there's been continued Australian industry involvement in the aircraft itself, right? So, and that should continue as now we end up in hopefully towards a multi-country partnership. So it's been a great opportunity. It's been great at the time, U.S. policy allowed groundbreaking technology to start as an export. So you can't throw every spear at ITAR. Yeah, sometimes it's got some things really right, and this is an example of it. If you look at MQ-28, it's sort of the other side of the coin. It's an Australian airplane, right? So it's Boeing Defense Australia, with Boeing money in general, with Australian government money, with RAF participation. What a great partnership to start off as a truly Australian aircraft that now might export to anywhere else. But there are challenges with that, and we've seen that the Australian government has taken on, hey, what if we have to export this in the future? What does that look like? And how does it want to partner with the U.S. to do so? And oh, by the way, now you tie it to something like the Missile Technology Control Regime, which the U.S. has a decade or two of exporting unmanned aircraft, and is still almost always paused as it's done so. So we sort of picked the most challenging scenario to do this. So I'm glad we're going through it together, right? I think we blazed a trail on E-7. I think with MQ-28, it's a huge opportunity, but it's also highlighted areas as both governments need to set a groundwork, as I sort of talked earlier, to stimulate innovation, that we can work together across companies. And I think you mentioned it, Stacy. There's sometimes a protectionist aspect for each of the countries. Sometimes there's a technology and secrets part, but without a sort of government to government framework to say, hey, we're all going to operate this way, we're not going to be able to maximize programs like those two that you mentioned to the best ability in the future.
Yeah, and it's clear that the challenges are so big today that no one country can handle them on their own, even the United States. So we need to find ways to do that. Shimon, I wanted to come back to you. You've worked a lot on capability development, and in addition to the AUKUS partnership, the UK has been very active internationally, and it has announced that it is working with Japan and Italy to build the next generation fighter. Analysts have sort of suggested that in addition to the obvious economic benefits that come from your country working with others, that this next generation fighter deal was born out of frustration with the US processes and the restrictions on technology sharing. So the UK is both working with the US and working with others. How do you go about balancing that?
I would reflect on the fact that across Western nations, we all form different partnerships and different capabilities where the right opportunities align for each other. I can absolutely reference areas where, for example, we have a very close and quite intimate relationship with France on missile capabilities. We have a very critical relationship with the US and Australia through AUKUS. But we all have multiple partnerships. And I think it's right, because I don't think it would be politically right, or indeed right from an industrial perspective or idea generation perspective, to say we align capabilities with only certain nations. We get a level of creativity, and we need to recognize that things are right for different scenarios. And it works. I don't think there's any tension between nations and between the UK, and that's absolutely how it should be. If for some areas we focus on with one country, and in another area we focus on other countries, we all do that, and it's the right thing to do. And I would say it's the right thing to do because capability development is not just about capability development, it's about political integration amongst nations. And therefore, if we only aligned ourselves with one or two nations, we all miss that opportunity to really embed a broader coalition across Western nations. I want to come back to one of the points very briefly that was mentioned, and that is this idea that I don't think anybody has a monopoly on idea generation. And if we need any reminder of that, the last year in Ukraine has shown us that the pressure of war drives a level of ingenuity and creativity that, boy, we would all really aspire for on a regular basis. And that's the importance of alliances as well. It's creativity, it's resilience, as has been said. But I also emphasize it's about developing political relationships. And what we must never do is say we'll only align ourselves with one or two or three countries. We all need to be part of that broader alliance.
Those are really important points. And it is true that there are, while the US, the UK, and Australia have a particularly close relationship and partnership together, there are a lot of other countries that need to come along and that are needed in order to strengthen deterrence. And that politically, and sometimes, from our own self-interested perspective of our nation, we have different relationships with and different interests, which takes me to my question for you, Stephen. I know there's been a little bit of tension over the years, and Australia has, like all nations, rightly emphasized that it needs its own sovereign capabilities. Like even the munitions base that you're looking at developing with the United States in some cases, it emphasizes sovereignty. And this has been one of the points that some critics have brought up with respect to AUKUS. How much sovereignty is Australia ceding as a part of this agreement? So how do you manage this sort of tension between integration and maintaining Australia's sovereign capabilities and protecting its own interests?
No, thank you. It's a really good question. I don't agree that AUKUS represents any ceding of Australian sovereignty, and it's something that we certainly are very alive to and looking at, because integration and working closely with partners isn't the same thing and doesn't have to be the same thing as ceding any level of sovereignty. Australia and the United States have worked very closely together operationally for decades now, and have done that very well and very effectively without any ceding of sovereignty or the ability for Australia to make its own decisions on how and why it uses its defence forces. And I don't see any reason why that needs to change. We are quite adept at understanding where our ability to make our own decisions lie. What I think strategic integration and institutional integration can do is really bed that in, a recognition that countries working together have the ability to make their own decisions and helps cement that idea of sovereignty into decision-making processes. And that's especially true with the way that we use our capability and the way that we develop our capability and the capability choices that we make. I think integration at a strategic level around capability choices doesn't mean we have to have everything the same or do everything together. What it says is that in some cases there are benefits from having capabilities and developing capabilities that will benefit all of us.
Definitely makes sense. And I agree with you there. I'm going to pull in a few questions from the audience here. Brian asks, he said there's been a lot of discussion about needing to reform or change ITAR or U.S. export controls, but less about what specifically needs to be done and what should be changed. What specific reforms would you recommend to facilitate greater integration between the defense industries of these three nations? Anyone want to jump in here?
I can jump in first. So, I suspect that other folks might have a few different recommendations, but one of the things that we actually recommended in the report is that wholesale ITAR reform is likely to be a bridge too far. U.S. export controls exist for a variety of different regions, and looking for overall reform is perhaps not necessarily going to be realistic in the time period that we're really trying to look at. So instead, it's trying to find those bright spots of where things show the most promise. And I think, again, sorry to keep on bringing everything back to AUKUS, but here we go again. AUKUS is one of those bright spots. So if you're trying to think about how it is you could create ITAR reforms to make AUKUS happen, one of the things that we suggested in our report is that there are ITAR exemptions that exist, and ITAR exemptions that exist for certain countries like Canada. Canada, the United States, Australia, and the UK are all members of NTIB, the National Technology Industrial Base. And so some of those exemptions that are provided to Canada could also be quite easily provided to Australia and the UK for certain defense items that fall under AUKUS in order to make that happen. Kevin Wolf, who's a former Assistant Secretary of Commerce, recently testified before Congress that small amendments could be made to existing ITAR sections, which really just require adding "and Australia and the United Kingdom" to those sections in order to create exemptions, at least to make parts of AUKUS happen without getting into some of the intricacies that would be required for broader ITAR reform.
Hey, Stacey, can I jump in on that one?
Please.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on Becca's point. To take it to the next level, right? To get even with Canada, we're not going to be able to use the exemption to start working on advanced technologies, right? So we're still going to need licenses. So I think what would help in using AUKUS to do so, right, is if AUKUS can take its advanced Pillar 2 technologies to the next level, right, of things that the countries plan on working on, all three countries agree to those, and then if we can get ITAR to rapidly approve, open licenses to support that, as long as the entities are, both Australian and UK. It would keep intact all of the sort of ITAR taint second level issues that scare people off from the exemption being applied, the Canadian exemption being applied in the other countries, and just allow industry at an idea level to go straight to those two countries and get to work. And if we could get those licenses approved in hours instead of months, and we can cut out that time, as I described earlier, to describe to U.S. government what the policy is, just as long as we're in a narrow AUKUS field, then let's get going. And I think that's a true opportunity that we can leverage AUKUS on. We're hearing, from the Hill and everyone else, that there's the political will to do this, as was mentioned by the other speakers. I'm hoping that can maybe be an outcome.
I'm conscious of time, but if I come in very briefly, so I'd absolutely echo the issue of open licenses, and I would really, really stress the issue of how do we change the timeframes of allowing approvals to happen and allowing information flows. As I said, I think there is possibly enough there that allows us to make some of this happen. The timeframes means that we will never, or we will find it extremely difficult to match where our adversaries are. They don't have these constraints. So our processes are our own adversary of success over here. And we need to address that, because the timeframes make things challenging for us to really accelerate technology opportunities.
I couldn't agree more. Time is of the essence these days, and we have wasted far too much of it, letting bureaucratic processes sometimes be in the way unnecessarily. So cutting through some of that red tape so we can move faster, which is something the Pentagon has tried to do for a long time and only partially succeeded, I think is really needed here. But I do think we should end on an optimistic note, because we are out of time, but there seems to be a lot of support for deepening defense integration between the United States and some of its closest allies, especially as a part of the AUKUS partnership. So hopefully we will find that some of these reforms are actually implemented, and a lot of the defense cooperation that we really need to have happen can come to fruition, and do so quickly, not in the matter of decades, but in the matter of months and years, because we have seen that countries can move quickly when they need to. In the case of Ukraine, to provide assistance, we just need to be more proactive going forward to deal with the magnitude of challenges that we're going to face in the coming years. So I wanted to thank everyone on the panel today for joining. This has been a wonderful discussion with a wide variety of perspectives, and I think we've contributed significantly to this discussion, and hopefully can see progress coming in the near term from it. So thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.